When HOA Karen kicked my lake cabin door at 3 a.m., I thought she just wanted to scare us. But she didn't realize my K9s were trained to protect, and my daughter was ready to command them. What started as a break-in turned into a full-blown standoff, and what Karen uncovered about my family left her screaming for help. It was 3 in the morning when the sound of boots pounding against wood jolted me awake, followed almost instantly by the violent crack of my lake cabin door being kicked wide open. The night had been still just moments before, the lake calm and the trees whispering only with the wind. But now that silence was shattered by the shrill, angry voice of Hoa Karen. She wasn't just knocking. She wasn't just yelling from the porch like she usually did. She had come with rage in her eyes, and this time she wasn't going to settle for shouting through the windows. She stormed inside like she owned the place, screaming about rules, compliance, and how no one was allowed to ignore her HOA's authority. In her mind, she had the power to control every inch of the neighborhood, even a cabin she had no claim to. At first, I thought it was just another one of her late-night tantrums. Karen had always been the type who thrived on intimidation, on scaring people into doing what she wanted. She'd harass neighbors about paint colors, scream at kids for riding bikes too fast, even threaten elderly couples with fines for having the wrong mailbox. But this time was different. She wasn't here with papers. She wasn't here with idle threats. The wild look in her eyes, the way she spat her words, the way she shoved the door open without hesitation, this wasn't the HOA president on a power trip. This was a woman convinced she was untouchable, convinced she could kick her way into my home at 3 a.m. and I'd simply roll over. But what she didn't know, what she had no way of understanding, was that my cabin wasn't undefended. She had just stepped into the one place she should never have crossed, because while Karen thought she was catching us off guard, while she believed her shouting and stomping were enough to control the situation, my K9s had already woken up the second her foot hit the porch. Their ears were sharp, their senses tuned for danger, and the intruder in the doorway had triggered every instinct they had. The low growls started first, deep in their throats, a sound that rolled through the cabin like a warning. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, locked on her, calculating every movement she made. Karen, of course, didn't notice at first. She was too busy screaming, too wrapped up in her performance, too certain that she was untouchable. She shouted about how we were breaking community law, how we were trespassers on HOA land, even though this cabin was mine, purchased long before her association ever laid a claim to the area. She demanded we come out, that we sign her papers, that we surrender to her authority. She didn't realize that every word she spat, every step deeper she took into the cabin, was only digging her deeper into the trap she had walked into. Then came the moment her eyes flicked to the shadows, the moment she finally noticed the gleam of teeth and the subtle shift of bodies low to the ground. The growling grew louder, filling every corner of the room. Karen froze mid-sentence, her confidence wavering as she realized she wasn't alone with just a tired family she could bully. No, she was standing face to face with trained K9s, dogs bred and raised for protection, animals that wouldn't hesitate for a second if I gave the command. Her face changed then. The smugness drained away, replaced by a flicker of doubt. She took a step back, but the dogs matched her movement, advancing in perfect sync, their eyes never leaving her. The air grew heavy, the tension so thick you could almost feel it pressing against your chest. I could see Karen's bravado starting to crumble, the way her voice shook slightly as she tried to bark another order, telling us we had to obey her HOA. But no one was listening anymore. And then my daughter stepped forward. Karen had always underestimated her, always mocked her as just a kid, too young to matter, too soft to stand up to authority. But what she didn't know, what she never could have guessed, was that my daughter wasn't afraid of her. She wasn't afraid of bullies, wasn't afraid of threats, and she sure wasn't afraid of a woman who thought a title in an HOA meeting gave her power. With one sharp whistle, my daughter gave the signal, not an attack, not yet, but enough to send the K9s circling, their snarls echoing off the cabin walls, their bodies a moving wall of muscle and teeth. Karen stumbled back, her voice rising in panic now. The woman who had marched in like a conqueror was suddenly scrambling for control, her eyes darting from one set of gleaming teeth to the next. She shouted threats, but they rang hollow. She screamed for us to call the dogs off, but the sound of her fear only made them stand taller, their ears forward, their bodies taut and ready. For the first time, Karen realized she wasn't the predator in this story. She was the prey. And in that moment, as the standoff stretched into eternity, something shifted. Karen uncovered a truth she had never considered. My family wasn't powerless. We weren't just stubborn neighbors refusing to bow to her HOA demands. We were stronger, smarter, and more prepared than she could ever have imagined. My daughter wasn't just some girl she could push around. She was a protector, someone trained to stand her ground, someone who could command dogs that didn't hesitate when danger appeared. What started as a break-in, what Karen thought would be just another one of her victories, had become the turning point she would never forget. The cabin she tried to invade was no longer just a house. It became the place where her arrogance finally met its match. She walked in believing she held the power, but she left with the memory of snarling dogs, a fearless daughter, and the cold, terrifying truth that she had crossed the one line she could never come back from. It was a dead of night at the lake cabin, the kind of silence that feels almost alive, where the water is calm and every sound carries. My family was asleep, the dogs curled near the door as they always were, and I was drifting somewhere between dreams when the sound hit. A thunderous crash, sharp enough to make the cabin walls vibrate, followed by the splintering crack of wood giving way under force. My eyes shot open just as another blow rattled the hinges, and then, with one final kick, the door burst open and slammed against the wall. Standing in the doorway, breathing heavily and screeching at the top of her lungs, was old Karen. She wasn't here for a neighborly complaint or another one of her long rants about rules and community standards. She was wild-eyed, enraged, and drunk on the delusion of authority. Her voice tore through the cabin like glass shattering. She screamed that we didn't belong here, that no one was allowed to live outside the HOA's reach, that she had warned us before and this time she wasn't going to take no for an answer. In her mind, every property around the lake was hers to police, every family hers to command. She'd bullied neighbors into painting their houses her approved colors, fined parents for toys left in yards, even sent out threats of eviction over flowers planted in the wrong place. But this time she had taken it further than anyone believed she ever would. She wasn't banging on windows. She wasn't shouting from the porch. She had broken down the door at 3 a.m. like some kind of outlaw enforcer. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Half asleep, standing in my own cabin, watching this woman I'd clashed with so many times march inside as though she owned the place. My first instinct was to tell her to get out, to order her back onto the porch and remind her she had no right here. But before the words left my mouth, something else stirred. A low growl, dark and heavy, rolled through the shadows at her feet. Karen froze for just a second, her shrill voice catching in her throat, but she kept her posture tall, her mouth twisted in a sneer. She didn't realize what she had just walked into. My K9s had been awake the moment she hit the first kick. Trained to protect, alert to every strange movement and sound, they had lifted their heads in unison and waited for the cue. And now, with their tails rigid and their teeth bared, they rose from the floorboards like predators rising out of the dark. Their growls grew louder, filling the cabin with sound that rattled Karen's bravado. Her eyes darted to the side and caught the gleam of their teeth and the faint glow from the moonlight. For the first time, the mask of arrogance on her face cracked. Still, she tried to play her role. She shouted that the dogs better be locked up, that she called animal control, that she had every right to enforce community order. But her voice wavered, and her steps backward betrayed her. Every inch she retreated, the dogs matched, moving fluidly in sync, forming a wall between her and the family she thought she could terrify. That's when my daughter stepped forward. Karen had always laughed at her, dismissed her as too young to matter, the kind of person she could intimidate without consequence. But my daughter was not the fragile target Karen believed her to be. Calm, steady, and unshaken, she lifted a hand and gave a sharp, precise whistle. Instantly, the K9's growls intensified, their muscles taut and ready, their eyes locked with hers, awaiting the command. They weren't wild beasts. They were disciplined protectors, trained to defend against real threats, and in that moment they knew exactly who the threat was. Karen's face went pale. Her voice shot up an octave, trembling now as she screamed that she was going to call the police, that we would all be arrested for assault. But the irony of it was bitter and sharp. She was the one who had broken in. She was the one who had kicked down the door. She was the one standing inside someone else's home in the dead of night. And the only thing keeping her upright was the hope that the dogs wouldn't strike before she could stumble back into the night. The standoff stretched out, the cabin heavy with tension. My daughter didn't blink. She stood firm, one hand raised, her voice steady as she gave another command, this one a short, clipped sound that made the dogs spread into formation, circling. Karen turned in a slow circle, panic rising as she realized she was surrounded. Every time she moved, a pair of teeth glinted in the shadows. Every time she tried to shout, the sound of snarling drowned her out. What had begun as her moment of triumph, her grand display of power, was unraveling before her eyes. She had come to break us, to humiliate us, to show she was untouchable. But now she was trapped, trembling, her back to the splintered door, her hands half raised like a thief caught red-handed. And then came the silence. For just a moment, all the growling stopped. The cabin felt so still it felt like the air had been sucked out. Karen's breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes darting from one dog to the next, searching desperately for some kind of mercy. My daughter stepped forward into the moonlight then, her face calm, her posture unflinching, and in that instant, Karen saw the truth. This wasn't just a girl she could bully. This was someone trained, disciplined, and fearless, someone who had grown up learning exactly how to command these K9s and exactly how to protect her family. The reality hit her harder than any fine or warning letter she had ever written. She wasn't in control here. She had never been in control. The power she clung to like armor had evaporated the moment she crossed that broken threshold. And now she stood in the center of a cabin she didn't own, surrounded by guardians she couldn't order away, facing a family she could never again intimidate. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the broken frame of the door, and in that moment the dog surged forward one step, forcing a scream out of her throat. She threw her arms up, begging, pleading, swearing she hadn't meant any harm. But the words rang hollow, every one of them tainted by the arrogance she had carried in with her. And though the dogs never touched her, though they stopped just short of sinking their teeth into her arm, the terror on her face told the story clearly enough. She knew she had gone too far. She knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross. When she finally scrambled out into the night, tripping over herself as she fled down the porch steps, the cabin seemed to exhale. The dogs lowered their heads, their growls fading into silence, their bodies slowly relaxing back into the guardians they always were. My daughter gave a final sharp command, and they returned to their places, calm and steady once again. But the echo of Karen's scream still hung in the air, a reminder of just how close she had come to a fate she would never forget. She had come believing she was untouchable, believing her HOA title gave her power even in the dead of night. But what she discovered in that cabin was a truth she would carry forever. Some families can't be broken, some doors can't be kicked down, and some battles end before they even begin, because the ones she thought were weak were stronger, sharper, and far more prepared than she had ever imagined. And from that night forward, the memory of growling dogs and a fearless daughter would haunt every step she took near our home. It was the middle of the night in my lake cabin, the kind of silence so deep that even the water outside seemed frozen in place, and the only sound was the occasional creak of wood as the house settled into the cool air. I was drifting between sleep and wakefulness when a thunderous crash jolted me upright. At first, I thought a tree branch had fallen against the porch, but before I could even reach for the lamp, the noise came again, louder, angrier, and then with one final violent kick the front door flew open, splintering at the hinges and slamming against the wall. In the doorway stood Karen, red-faced, wild-eyed, and screaming at the top of her lungs. She wasn't holding papers or shouting empty threats from the safety of her yard like she usually did. This time she was inside my home at 3 a.m, her fists clenched, her voice breaking the silence of the lake with a shrill fury that made every hair on my neck stand up. She screamed that I had no right to live here, that my cabin was out of compliance, that she had warned me again and again, and tonight she was going to put an end to my refusal. She stormed inside as if she owned the place, spitting words about authority, rules, and power, convinced that this was the night she would finally bend us to her will. I should have been afraid. Any normal person, woken in the dead of night by an intruder screaming in their home, would have panicked. But what Karen didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly know, was that she hadn't just broken into my cabin. She had walked straight into the one place she could never hope to control. Before I could even rise from bed, before she had finished her first round of threats, a sound started low and steady, rising out of the dark corners of the room. A growl, deep and resonant, the kind that vibrates in your chest and sends a shiver down your spine. My K9s were already awake. They had sensed her before she even touched the door, and now, with her body half inside my cabin and her arrogance on full display, they were ready to do what they had been trained for all their lives. Karen didn't notice at first. She was too busy shouting, too blinded by her own rage to realize that shadows were shifting at her feet. She barked orders about how we were going to sign her HOA forms, how we were going to be fined, how she had every right to enforce her authority. But then her eyes flicked to the side, catching the faint gleam of teeth in the moonlight streaming through the broken doorway. The growling grew louder, joined by the shuffle of paws against the wood floor. My dogs, massive, disciplined, and fiercely loyal, stepped into the faint light one by one, their eyes locked on her every movement. In that moment, the bravado on Karen's face faltered. Her words stuttered, her voice cracked, and though she tried to keep her posture high, her body betrayed her with a step backward. The dogs advanced in perfect rhythm, their shoulders tense, their ears forward, their teeth bared just enough to make her freeze in place. She tried to recover her confidence, shouting about how we'd be arrested for assault if the dogs touched her, but even she could hear the desperation in her own voice. Every time she moved, the growling deepened. Every time she lifted her hands, the dogs shifted closer. The cabin that she had stormed into like a conqueror had suddenly turned into a cage, and she was the one cornered inside it. That was when my daughter stepped out from the hallway. Karen had always dismissed her, always laughed and called her just a kid, too soft and too young to matter. But she wasn't a child to be bullied anymore, and she wasn't afraid. She walked forward with calm, steady steps, her eyes never leaving Karen. Her hand raised in a signal the dogs knew by heart. With a sharp whistle, she gave the command, not to attack but to hold their ground, to show the intruder just how close she was to learning what real fear felt like. The dogs fanned out into a formation, circling the woman who had once terrified neighbors with her letters and fines, their bodies tense and ready, their snarls filling the room with a promise of violence. Karen's face drained of color. Her hands shook as she raised them, stumbling backward until her heel caught on the broken doorframe. She tried to keep shouting, tried to sound like the authority she always claimed to be, but her voice wavered and cracked with every syllable. She looked from one dog to the next, her eyes darting like a trapped animal, her chest heaving as she realized she was surrounded. She begged then, her words spilling out faster, promising she hadn't meant to harm anyone, swearing she only came to talk, but the fear in her voice betrayed her. The dogs didn't move. They held her in place with nothing but their presence, waiting for the next command. My daughter stood tall in the moonlight, fearless and unshaken. For the first time, Karen saw the truth. This wasn't just a family she could bully into compliance. This wasn't just a girl she could laugh at. This was a protector, trained and confident, standing between her family and the intruder, commanding animals that could end the standoff in a heartbeat. The realization hit her harder than any fine she'd ever written, harder than any petty victory she'd ever claimed. She wasn't in control here. She never had been. The silence pressed down heavy. Even the lake outside seemed to hold its breath. Karen's knees buckled as she took another step back, and the dog surged forward just enough to send her stumbling into the night air. She screamed, a sound high and broken, and scrambled down the porch steps as though the hounds of hell were chasing her. My daughter gave one final command, and the dogs returned to their posts, their growls fading, their bodies relaxing back into calm watchfulness. The cabin settled again into silence, the only evidence of the confrontation the splintered wood of the door and the echo of Karen's panicked cries fading into the distance. That night, she discovered a truth she would never forget. She had come believing she was untouchable, believing her HOA title gave her power over every home and every family she laid eyes on. She thought breaking down a door at 3 a.m. would make us kneel to her authority. Instead, she learned that some doors lead to places she can never control. Some families cannot be broken, and some battles end before they even begin. She walked in thinking we were weak. She left knowing we were stronger than she could ever imagine, and the memory of snarling K9s and a fearless daughter would haunt her every step from that night on. It was just past 3 a.m. when the crash came, so violent and sudden it rattled the whole cabin. At first, I thought it might have been a storm rolling in, a tree branch snapping in the wind, something natural that belonged to the night. But then the second blow struck, sharp and deliberate, followed by the splintering sound of wood giving way under force. My eyes flew open, my heart racing, and in that instant I knew this wasn't the storm. This wasn't the woods. This was something far worse. Before I could reach the lamp, the door slammed open with one final kick, the hinges groaning, and the quiet of the lake was torn apart by the shrill, piercing voice of the one person I had hoped never to see on my porch again. HOA Karen stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with rage. She wasn't there to argue. She wasn't there to hand me another notice. She wasn't even there to shout from the safety of the yard like she usually did. No, this time she had stormed right into my home as if she owned it, spitting fury in every direction, declaring that we had no right to live outside the control of her association. Her voice carried like broken glass, cutting through the night as she hurled threats about fines, lawsuits, and community rules. She called me a trespasser on my own land, screamed that she had the power to remove me, claimed she had the authority to drag my family out if we didn't comply. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. For years she had harassed neighbors with petty citations, bullied families into repainting their homes, fined people for parking in their own driveways. She thrived on fear, on control, on making people bend just to avoid her wrath. But tonight she had taken her crusade further than anyone could have imagined. She had broken into a private cabin in the middle of the night, convinced that she could intimidate us into surrender. She thought she could kick down our door and own the silence of the lake with nothing more than her shrieking commands. What she didn't know was that the moment her boot hit the porch, she had already lost. My dogs had stirred before the first kick, their ears twitching, their muscles tense, their instincts sharper than any lock or alarm. The instant the door gave way and Karen stepped across the threshold, the low rumble of their growls filled the cabin. It was a sound that rolled like thunder through the floorboards, deep and primal, the kind of warning that freezes the blood in your veins. At first, Karen didn't notice. She was too wrapped up in her own fury, too blinded by her need to dominate the space she had invaded. She spat her threats at the walls, at the family she thought she could terrify, at the idea of control she believed she already owned. But then the noise rose, louder this time, joined by the shifting of bodies in the shadows. Her head turned sharply, her eyes catching the faint gleam of teeth in the moonlight. And just like that, the bravado faltered. From the dark corners of the cabin, the K9s emerged, their eyes locked on her, their shoulders squared, their steps perfectly measured. These were not pets barking at a stranger. These were trained guardians, disciplined, alert, and absolutely ready to defend the home they belonged to. Their snarls vibrated against the walls, their teeth bared just enough to make the message unmistakable. Every inch Karen stepped backward, they matched it with a step forward, their formation tightening, their eyes never leaving her. She tried to shout again, tried to bluff her way through the terror building in her chest, warning that she'd call the police, threatening that we'd be charged if the dogs touched her. But even as the words left her mouth, her voice cracked, the fear seeping through every syllable. And then my daughter appeared. Calm, steady, and absolutely unshaken, she stepped out from the hallway and into the silver wash of moonlight cutting through the broken door. For years, Karen had dismissed her, mocked her, treated her as if she were invisible or insignificant. But now she stood in full command of the moment, her hand raised in a signal the dogs recognized instantly. A sharp, precise whistle cut through the room, and the K9 shifted, circling, closing the distance, their growls rising to a crescendo that drowned out the night. Karen's eyes widened, her body trembling as she spun in a slow, terrified circle, realizing for the first time that she was surrounded. Her confidence shattered completely. She raised her hands, her shrieks turning into pleas, her threats collapsing into broken excuses. She swore she hadn't meant harm, that she was only trying to enforce the rules, that this was all some misunderstanding. But the dogs didn't care about her words, and neither did we. They stood their ground, every muscle taut, every eye fixed, waiting for the next signal. My daughter didn't flinch, didn't waver, didn't give in to Karen's frantic gasps. She stood tall, her presence commanding not just the dogs, but the entire room, and in that moment Karen finally saw the truth she had refused to believe. The family she thought she could bully was not afraid of her. The girl she thought was weak was stronger than she could ever be. The house she thought she could control belonged to no one but us, and it was guarded by protectors she could never hope to intimidate. The silence that followed was unbearable. Karen's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling as if every nerve had turned to fire. The dogs lowered their bodies closer to the ground, ready to spring if the command came, their eyes glowing in the moonlight like living weapons. My daughter's whistle broke the silence again, short and sharp, and the formation shifted tighter. That was all it took. Karen's courage finally shattered. She stumbled backward, tripping on the splintered frame of the door, and fell into the night air. Her scream tore through the stillness of the lake as she scrambled down the porch, her hands clawing at the steps, her body moving faster than her thoughts could keep up. She ran like she was being hunted, her figure shrinking into the darkness until all that remained was the echo of her panicked cries bouncing across the water. Inside the cabin, the tension eased. The growling faded, the K9s retreating to their posts with one final command, their loyalty unshaken, their watchful eyes still scanning the open doorway. My daughter lowered her hand, her breathing steady, her posture unbroken. The cabin settled once again into silence, though this silence was different. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of before. It was heavy with the weight of what had just happened, charged with the knowledge that everything had changed. Karen had come into our home certain that she held power, certain that her title and her arrogance made her untouchable. But she had left with the truth burned into her memory, a truth she would never escape no matter how much she tried to deny it. She had discovered that some doors should never be kicked in, some families will never be broken, and some battles are lost before they even begin. She had walked in thinking she could control us. She left knowing she would never control us again. And from that night forward, the memory of snarling K9s and the fearless daughter who commanded them would follow her every step, a reminder that she had finally met the line she could never cross. It was the kind of night where the lake was still and the trees outside whispered only when the breeze shifted, the sort of silence you could feel in your bones. I had just drifted into a restless sleep when the sound hit sharp and violent, rattling the walls of the cabin like a shotgun blast. My heart jumped before my mind caught up. Another crash followed, heavier, closer, and I knew immediately it wasn't a storm. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything natural. It was deliberate. Something, or rather someone, was forcing their way in. I barely had time to swing my legs over the side of the bed before the door exploded inward, the wood splintering under one final kick, and there she stood. HOA Karen. Her hair a tangled mess, her eyes wild, her chest heaving with the kind of rage that doesn't care about consequences. She stormed into my cabin as though she owned it, her voice screeching accusations and threats, claiming I had no right to live here, no right to ignore the rules of her HOA, no right to ignore the rules of her HOA, no right to exist beyond her control. For years she had been a plague on the neighborhood, parading around with her clipboard, writing citations for grass length, barking at families for leaving out trash cans a few minutes too long, fining people for parking in their own driveways. But this was different. She wasn't just standing on a porch screaming about bylaws or threatening legal action from the safety of her car. She had crossed a line so sharp it felt like the world split in two. She had broken into my home in the dead of night, convinced she could intimidate me into submission. She thought her power reached everywhere, even here, even to this cabin by the lake that stood far outside her jurisdiction. She thought fear alone would make me surrender. But she didn't realize she had just set foot in the wrong place at the wrong time. The moment the door burst open, the dogs stirred. They had been restless since the first thud, their ears twitching, their bodies coiled like springs waiting to release. As Karen stomped in, screaming about rules and trespassing, the growls started low, vibrating against the floorboards, rolling up through the cabin like thunder. At first, she didn't even hear them. She was too wrapped in her fury, too obsessed with her need to control the moment. She waved her hand, spat venom about court orders and police backup, claimed she had the right to drag us out by force so we didn't comply. But her words faltered when the growls grew louder, when the shadows shifted and her eyes caught the gleam of teeth in the moonlight. The K9 stepped forward, one by one, silent except for the deep rumble in their throats. Their muscles tensed, their eyes locked on her every movement. These weren't pets barking at a stranger. They were trained guardians, disciplined, focused, bred and raised to protect. Each step Karen took backward was mirrored by their advance, slow and deliberate, the kind of choreography that spoke louder than any words ever could. Her voice cracked as she tried to reassert control, threatening lawsuits, shouting that we regret this. But the tremor in her words betrayed her. She could feel the balance shifting, feel the air changing around her. For once, she was no longer the one in command. Then my daughter stepped forward. Calm, collected, her face a mask of steady resolve, she emerged from the hallway where she had been watching. Karen's eyes darted to her with that same mocking disdain she had always shown, the belief that my daughter was soft, that she was weak, that she was easy to intimidate. But what she saw now shattered that illusion. My daughter raised her hand in a sharp signal the dogs recognized instantly, and with a whistle that cut through the tension like a blade, the formation tightened. The K9s circled, their growls intensifying, their eyes glowing in the silver wash of moonlight. The room trembled with their power, and Karen's knees nearly buckled as she realized just how wrong she had been. She tried to backpedal, tried to spin her way out of the moment, claiming she hadn't meant any harm, that she was only enforcing the rules, that this was all a misunderstanding. But her excuses sounded hollow against the thunder of growls. She raised her hands, her shrieking tone collapsing into pleas, begging us to call off the dogs, begging us to listen. My daughter didn't flinch. Her voice was steady, commanding, filled with the kind of authority that Karen could never hope to match. With a single gesture, she kept the dogs in check, their bodies low, ready to strike if the word came. The cabin vibrated with tension, and for the first time in her life, Karen tasted fear that no amount of bluster could cover. Seconds stretched into eternity. Karen's breaths came in ragged gasps, her eyes darting desperately for a way out. The dogs moved closer, their snarls rising in unison, their bodies forming a living wall of muscle and teeth. My daughter stood tall, unbroken, a commander in her own right, her presence radiating strength. The image was burned into Karen's mind. The family she had tried to bully, the girl she had mocked, the guardian she had underestimated. All of it crashing down on her at once, smothering her in a reality she had refused to acknowledge until now. She was not in control. She never had been. When my daughter gave the second whistle, short and sharp, the sound was too much for Karen to bear. She spun, stumbling over the splinter remains of the doorframe, her hands clawing for balance as she tripped onto the porch. Her scream pierced the night, high-pitched and ragged, echoing across the still lake as she bolted into the darkness. Her footsteps hammered against the wood, then against the dirt, then faded into the distance, swallowed by the trees. She didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to curse us like she usually did. She ran as though her very life depended on it, because in her mind, it probably did. Inside the cabin, the air finally loosened. The dogs held their ground, watchful, their ears still tuned to the night beyond the broken doorway. My daughter lowered her hand, her breathing steady, her posture unshaken. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was thick, charged, heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. The rules of this fight had been rewritten. The illusion of Karen's power had been torn apart, shattered under the teeth and growls of guardians she could never control, and the resolve of a girl she had underestimated for far too long. Karen came here believing she was untouchable, that her title, her clipboard, and her arrogance gave her authority beyond limits. She left with the memory of snarling K9s burned into her soul, with the image of a daughter she thought was weak standing tall as her commander. That night taught her the one truth she could never erase. There are some doors you do not kick down, some families you do not threaten, and some battles you lose before you ever begin.